Now, there has been a report published into the infamous bike shed scandal. Gavin, what does it say?
Can I shock you? It says that spending 336 grand on a bike shelter is bad, and that there was a lack of certain financial oversight in the whole thing. This is an independent report.
We could have told them that before.
In a stunning development, they've paid Deloitte to tell them that spending loads of money on a bike shelter is not great. But what Deloitte have actually done, so Deloitte were asked by the OPW, who obviously themselves built the bike shelter, they were asked to try and review some of the procedures around how these things are overseen and what sort of financial projects. And it basically turns out the OPW have a different threshold for projects that cost $500,000 or more, that if they think from the outset it's going to cost $500,000, they have escalated controls, and there's a lot more value for money audits and these sorts of things that happen before you basically turn a sod or you do any proper construction at all. But that they didn't exist for projects that were under $500,000. And moreover, and then I think this was already widely known anyway, but it's helpful to see it in black and white. It also finds that the OPW did not tell the Oireachtas what they thought it was going to cost before they actually then set about doing the project. So there was no opportunity for the Oireachtas to go, wait a minute, 330 grand. Actually, on second thoughts, could we just not do it? Or could we do a scaled back version somewhere else? But that option was never made available to the Leinster House authorities because the OPW basically went and took the ball and ran off with it without liaising with anyone else. But what they've recommended now is in future that there would be similarly escalated procedures where anything that's going to cost even under $500,000 still has to be subject to certain amounts of oversight, certain amounts of referral with the other body that might be, taking over the facility afterwards. At least so there's a bit more over and back that the OPW doesn't get the idea for a project, then pursue the project without the ultimate occupants or the ultimate custodians knowing what's going on and finding out after the fact that they've actually found themselves on the hook publicly and in publicity wise for something they didn't have anything to do with.
Is there a potential then this could be spun though as almost as a negative thing in that everything, even lower value projects, might now be bound with red tape stopping them or hanging them up when there might be a pertinent need for these things or a quick need for these things to be turned around.
This is the media groupthink that they warned you about, because that was precisely my first concern as well, that if they were now telling you that you had to have escalated scrutiny and more value for money analysis. I mean, look, in principle, value for money analysis is not a bad thing for anything.
Yeah,
but it doesn't look like there's in the reading that I've had of it so far, it doesn't look like there's like a lower threshold beyond which you can go back to the slightly more casual thing they were doing. So if the OPW is building a wall that might only cost 3,000 or 4,000, or I don't know what walls cost, but if they're doing something fairly rudimentary, it's a banana. What could it cost? $10? Well, there was the wall in Lansdowne Road, wasn't there? But if they're doing even something more rudimentary that really shouldn't entail anything more than fairly routine, are they still required to do a value for money analysis? And will there be bureaucracy and other things that then delay the whole thing and red tape as you describe it? So I don't know. And actually it will be interesting to see downstream, does this extra level of following the book and making sure that everything is spent as efficiently as it can be, does that actually result in more procedure tying these things up, and will it make getting relatively minor jobs more cumbersome in future because there's a lot more scrutiny that may in some cases not really be warranted? Like obviously there has to be a threshold beyond which scrutiny is warranted and deserved, but like there has to be a lower bound of that as well. And of course there is the other point too, that if the Leinster House authorities hypothetically might have thought that a bike shelter might only cost a couple of thousand, if there was no estimate banded around, but it's reasonable to think you could do it pretty cheaply. What reason will they have to follow up with the OPW to say, by the way, how much is that charging? Like if you think it's going to be a simple job, you're not really going to ask for value for money assessments because you think, sure, how do we need to make sure that there's value here? It's a bike shelter. What could it possibly cost?
Yeah, the problem I think a lot of the time with these investigations and reports is that they rarely find anyone responsible because they're not meant to find anyone responsible. Isn't that the gist of it? Like the gist of these reports is that no blame game is really involved in it. So they sort of dance around the issues, lessons will be learned, but ultimately no one's actually accountable for it.
Our favourite phrase, systems failure, where basically the procedure through which there ought to have been oversight.
Has anybody made the point though as to whether or not there was actually need for the bike shed in the first place? Like I know, because if people don't know Leinster House, often where you're doing lives from the shop as it's known, there's a little bike rail there. There's a bike rail there at the other side where the public entrance to Leinster House as well.
But they've got no overhead shelter, so they can get rained on. Now, there's analogue ways of dealing with that, like putting a plastic bag over your saddle. Like
that's how most school kids would do it, all right. But no, of course, like it's a standardised question for something like this.
And was the whole point of it not that they wanted to urge more people to leave the car at home, and it was kind of a major get cycling policy? But then arguably a lot of the rural TDs would probably drive up anyway the first working day of the week, so they probably would bring the car the first day.
Well, yeah, the rural ones would, and this is a matter that might be entertained in a book forthcoming. But the more regional TDs would definitely drive up and stay up in hotels for 2 nights at a time. But the ones that might be around Dublin, who might be within cycling distance, might not have ever done so previously and might have driven because they just didn't think that there was anywhere secure, that you wouldn't come out at the end of a long day and find that your bike was soaked and then you'd be going home with a soggy backside. So at least there was some sense of urgency on that front. And in fairness, the report that's published today by Deloitte does recognise that there was a legitimacy or a need for there to be a bike shelter. It's not as if this was a flight of fancy where someone just decided to do a fancy thing to whittle away some money that didn't need to be whittled. That there was good need for it, particularly because the other bike parking spaces in the venue don't have any shelter. So there was need for it, and it was appropriate that it be done. But whether it was appropriate that amount be spent, and whether the Leinster House authorities should have been given the opportunity to intervene and say, actually, you know what, plan B or plan C, they just never given that window.
I think it's just unfortunate for the government that the bike shed has become this real symbol of like everything that's wrong with the country. I think you'll often hear people, if they want to give out about something, they'll reflect back or they'll call back the bike shed. I think it's going to be a long time before the bike shed becomes yesterday's chip papers. Gavin, just in terms of Simon Harris, because we were reading in the papers in the last week a little bit of insider criticism, I would say, maybe from his colleagues in Fine Gael. Tell us about that.
So the interesting thing about there was 2 different independent reports, not independent with a lowercase I because it wasn't the Irish Independent, it was the Irish Times and the Sunday Times. Both did work inside the last week about Simon Harris's standing within the party, particularly now that he's no longer Taoiseach. He's a little over a year in the job, so there's a certain amount of introspection going on now as to how he has done. But what was fascinating was that both of those different sort of parallel inquiries appeared to come back with one common trait of criticism of Simon Harris, which is that he's still spreading himself too thinly, and that he's still, to some degree, carrying the persona or the general public demeanour of someone who is the Taoiseach and commenting on everything and being seen to be in attendance at everything and spreading himself so thinly that actually the nuts and bolts of his own job, whether that's Fine Gael leader or as Minister for Trade or as Minister for Foreign Affairs or as Minister for Defence, are all being like relegated to a secondary thing. And it's always really telling when 2 people go independently kicking around a story to try and figure out what his standing is, and they come back hearing the same criticism, because it does suspect to a certain degree that there's no smoke without fire, that there must be genuine belief within the party that he is dealing with things a little bit too superficially and not actually rolling his sleeves up and getting involved in real nuts and bolts stuff.
Now, I did ask Simon Harris about this. He was in Killarney on Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember, for the PD4 conference. Anyway, he was here. We said it to him. We said, are you under a bit of pressure internally from your party colleagues? A lot of them are saying that you're not delivering on your promises. You're spending a little bit too much time on social media. This is the answer he gave us. You would find it hard to believe that that's the question we asked, but take a listen to the answer nonetheless.
Not at all, but I feel a huge obligation when your colleagues have made you the leader of your party, a huge obligation to do well for them. But much more importantly, a huge obligation to do well for the country. And that's what we're all committed to do.
Pretty stock answer there, Richard, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. As you say, it's given that he's a year in the job, it is a time for taking stock, I suppose. I mean, he had a point. I was listening to some of his answers before that, and he was talking about, you know, these are unattributed quotes, and everybody in political parties likes a nice moan to journalists off the record. Yeah, like you can say whatever you want, really. It doesn't. There's no. You know. There's no comeback on it. Like, you're not getting yourself in trouble. Yeah. You can have a gripe about anybody.
Yeah, but don't pretend that you don't love meeting a loose-lipped TD who wants to have an elbow into you.
Oh no, totally. Like, I mean, paper doesn't refuse ink. You know what I mean? And this isn't to cast any aspersions on anybody. These are legitimate criticisms that are there. But I don't know how serious it is in terms of the feeling within Fine Gael. Like, I don't feel like Simon Harris is in any immediate danger. I saw that he did get some flack for his suggestion that Ireland should follow Australia in going for social media ban for people under the age of 16, which obviously hasn't even started yet in Australia. It is something which is currently being worked out. But people were automatically saying this is just another way of getting himself in the headlines. This is not workable whatsoever. I feel to a certain extent, I don't want this to come across like this is some sort of gallant defence of Simon Harris. But like I feel like to a certain extent, even the suggestion of something like that, which is something, whether the question of going out that far in terms of degree is the right answer or not, it's something which everybody has a concern about. But it's obviously, it seems like it's almost too easy of a thing to attack him about. Like, we should be having a discussion on what we do about social media for kids. So just as well, somebody senior had a suggestion about what one potential way of looking at it, and then maybe we can all work together and figure out what the solution is.
And to be fair, on that point, he did make the sense that it's his job that people in Leinster House are paid to come up with these ideas and debate the nuts and bolts of how exactly you achieve that. So he made no apology for that. Although it was interesting that he came up, the public announcement of this idea of his was this day last week in response to a Leaders' Questions contribution from Paul Gogarty. So it wasn't as if it was even a scripted or a teed up question from one of his own backbenchers that he could use as a means to announce this. By the way, what I understand is that there's been a small amount of internal pushback within government, not about the idea itself per se, but about Simon Harris announcing that on the floor of the Dáil when, depending on who you believe, it's either a matter for the Minister for Children, who is Norma Foley, or the Minister for Education, yes, it's Helen McEntee, and Norma Foley took it up last time. Is it a job for the Minister of Communications, which is Darragh O'Brien? Is it supposed to be part of the Media Ministry, which is Patrick O'Donovan? That it wasn't necessarily that there's some of the Fianna Fáil ministers feel like they ought to have some kind of input in that whole process, and they felt a little bit sidelined that the Taoiseach was announcing what might be construed as new national government policy without bringing them into the loop first.
I mean, he's the leader of a party. He's leader of one of the biggest parties in the country. Every party should have its own policy. Obviously, he's part of the government. He's the deputy leader of said government. So, yeah, checking things off. But I suppose it's not too inappropriate for Fine Gael to say maybe we should have a look at social media. And obviously, he held those meetings when he was Taoiseach with the social media providers themselves, the networks, I should say, as well as other groups involved in as well. So it is something he has worked on. But I mean, we can talk about social media and children until the cows come home. We can also talk about criticisms of Simon Harris until the cows come home as well, whether they are in his party or outside of his party. But I suppose, I mean, the question is, at what point does he start to worry about whispers from Fine Gael TDs famously will whisper about their party leader, doesn't matter how well they're doing in the polls. At what point do you start to worry about that?
Well, the funny thing is that the polls, to some sense, are the only thing they've got to go on for the next 3 years, because we are in this kind of weird void now where, aside from the presidential election, which is one that Fine Gael have never won, so in a way it's a kind of a free hit, that if Simon Harris doesn't win the presidency, it's not that big a deal. No one else in Fine Gael has ever done it either. But after that, we're in this void where there are no elections until the summer of 2029, local and European elections then. And he's due to become Taoiseach again in the meantime. So it's hard to see where the momentum could suddenly exist, where there's some proper electoral hard data reason to decide to throw him overboard. I mean, look, that's not to say that TDs don't ever get trigger happy, because they do, and there's a track record of it happening.
I'd also just add, though, that Simon Harris has the most amount of newly elected TDs in his party. So they're newbies, and Cav is knocking over the place there. They're newbies, and they're already potentially in order with him. Do you know what I mean? To have your new staff members potentially being among those saying you're not doing the job properly is not really great.
Well, although the one counterpoint to that is that the one cohort of people who are most insecure about their own jobs are the people who are only just freshly in them. And if they've just moved a lot of the machinery of their lives to try and make this new career work, they will feel like they're very invested in making sure they hang on to those jobs. And often they are the ones who will get the most trigger happy if it turns out they reckon that the leader who is there is going to result them or lead them back into unemployment whenever the next election comes around.
That's interesting. We'll watch very closely. I just want to end this part on a bit of good news, Gavin, because Rebecca Meehan, listeners will remember, was on the pod with us a couple of weeks ago. She was trying to get a school place for her son Jay in Dungarvan in County Waterford, and you texted us during the week with a bit of good news.
Yes, she has finally got there. People remember that Rebecca was sitting here with us a few months ago talking about the lottery for places in the local school where her son Jay was trying to get enrolment, and how it was so oversubscribed that even the local Garda superintendent had to supervise the lottery, and how other things that parents might take for granted just do not fall so easily for children or for the parents of children with special needs. But thankfully, last week, some good news. It was a particularly agonising saga for Rebecca, because even after her own campaign to try and get more classes open in the school, they were then able to accept another batch of pupils, and her son wasn't within them, that there was still oversubscription, and she still wasn't lucky enough to fall within the net. But thankfully, some of the others have now found alternative places, and effectively what has all resulted in a saga of well over 100 days has resulted in Jay getting the offer that he wanted for the school that he wanted for next September, and we hope that's the end of the saga and that everyone is very happy ever after.
It really does, and I'm delighted with that news, but also it sort of puts in context and puts in perspective the other things we were talking about there in this segment as well. TDs need to start focusing more, I think, on delivering for people in terms of education, in terms of rent, in terms of housing. The focus on the bike shed is something we were all annoyed about there are much bigger fish to fry, and griping about who your party leader is at a time when we're just after finishing having a general election. Let's get on with the real business of trying to fix all of the broken things in this country.